Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. My name is Mario Veen. When we think of Plato's prisoners in the cave, can we really say that they experience life? They do not experience the cave at all, only the shadows. If they experience something, it's indirectly. Anything that is not expressed in the language of the shadows does not make sense to them. Another way of saying this is that their experience depends on the symbolic order in which they live. We often think of experience as something very direct and raw. But if we take Plato's allegory seriously, our experience is mediated. In Plato's allegory, the release of the prisoner from his situation in which everything makes sense is involuntary. They are forced to stand up and turn around, and their eyes hurt. They are dragged upwards. Plato writes that if they would get a chance, they would run back to their old seat. And can you blame them? But imagine if they did. They would be traumatized. They would be unable to make sense of their experience, if you can even call it that. And yet they would be unable to forget it as well. They would have to live with two realities at once. The reality of what they have witnessed and the reality of the society that they return back into. Perhaps they would find a way, but that's for another episode. In the previous episode about geology, we spoke about big numbers that we cannot make sense of, such as the age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years old. I can understand this number somehow, and yet it is abstract. It has no real meaning to me. Let me tell you another number, 6 million. That is the estimated number of Jews that died in the Holocaust, and many millions more if we count all Holocaust victims. This number makes no sense to me. It is unimaginable. And yet it happened. And there are other events in the past and in the present where unimaginable amounts of human beings died because of other human beings. It happened, and it happens, and we cannot ignore it. But I think that 76 years after the Holocaust, we can still hardly integrate it into our cultural memory, into our stories, our symbolic order. In the allegory of the cave, Plato speaks about someone who sees the true forms, the ideas and the ideals. Well, across history there have been so many people who claim to have seen these ideas and that they have the right to destroy anything that, in their opinion, did not conform to them. They had a clear idea about the way the world should be, which identities have the right to exist and which do not, which ways of being are better than others. The philosopher Adorno, himself a Holocaust survivor, said that this real event shattered the idealistic way in which some philosophers and politicians had approached identity. He wrote that our metaphysical faculty is paralyzed because actual events have shattered the basis on which speculative metaphysical thought could be reconciled with experience. That in the concentration camps it was no longer an individual who died, but a specimen. For me personally, as someone living in the Netherlands, the Holocaust is a cultural trauma that I have to come to terms with. For you, it may not be that, it may be something else. It may be the effects of slavery, or the Armenian genocide, or the cultural genocide that is happening right now in Tibet. Or it may be something more individual, such as being a victim of a crime or something else that happened to you. What can we in our society, in our cave, do to create an environment in which traumatized people can make sense of their trauma? Today I will speak with Ernst van Alphen, who studied the relationship between experience and trauma by looking very closely at, among other things, the Holocaust, art, and testimonies of Holocaust survivors. Ernst calls trauma felt experience. Studying trauma also shows that, in fact, the experience we have every day are always mediated. What this means we will see later. Ernst van Alphen is Professor of Literary Studies at Universiteit Leiden. His publications include Shame and Masculinity, Veiled Images, Photography and its Counter-Practices, Staging the Archive, Art and Photography in the Age of New Media, and today we will speak especially about his book Caught by History, Holocaust Effects in Contemporary Art, Literature and Theory. Ernst was so kind to make an older version of this chapter that we will discuss today available. It is called Symptoms of Discursivity, and I will provide a link in the description below where you can download it. Ernst, thank you for speaking with me this morning.
I'm very happy that you invited me, and it's an honor for me to be part of this.
We're going to speak about experience and trauma and memory in general. But you did research on a specific and a very extreme case of both a personal and collective trauma, which is the Holocaust. So in your book, Caught by History, you examine, among other things, testimonies of the Holocaust survivors. And I have to admit that even reading about these horrible events and how they speak about that, it had an actual emotional impact on me. It's not, you don't do it for pleasure. You don't read these things for pleasure. I think we all agree it's an important topic, but I wonder, why did you focus, at least in this book and at the work that you did at the time, why did you choose to focus on the Holocaust? And how do you deal with, reading these horrible stories? How do you deal with that on an emotional level?
When I started to work on Holocaust representation, imagination, and so on, I had worked for a very long time on postmodernism and post-structuralism. And especially in the Netherlands, there was a very negative opinion about postmodernism. And it was, for instance, Karel Peters, reviewer for the Vrij Nederland, was all the time writing very critically about postmodernism, because according to him, he reduced postmodernism as a complete misunderstanding to the idea that everything is text and there is no reality. So, and he even wrote at a certain moment, the Holocaust is only a fiction created by texts. And I think that's such complete nonsense. But for me, it was also a kind of challenge, this complete misunderstanding about the implications of postmodernism and post-structuralism. I decided then to write, after I had done my dissertation, and so to do a research on the Holocaust from a post-structuralist perspective. And it should be clear from page 1 that this kind of research has nothing to do with Holocaust denial. Then another thing which I was confronted with, because there were also personal reasons for me why I was interested in the Holocaust, but those were not really relevant. But I grew up in the 1960s, 70s, and in Holocaust studies, it turns out there's a very strong division between history and the imaginative. So everything which is imaginative, which is fictional or in relation to art, is suspect. Yeah. Whereas everything should be historical, because so that's why testimonies, diaries, documentaries, they can be trusted, or archives. But the moment that the imagination comes in, that is suspect. And so there's a very strong binary opposition in that field between the real and the historical and versus the imaginative.
Because there have been some films about the Holocaust, like the Spielberg film.
Schindler's List. People from in Holocaust studies are they're extremely critical about that film because it is not the truth about reality. In a way, it's a fiction, and it also because of its positive ending. Suddenly, at the end, there is color, and no, there is no positive ending for the Holocaust. So this show kind of the imagination. So this is a bad film, according to people in that domain. But I became hooked by that past of the Holocaust, not through historical representations, not through documentaries, not through the diary of Anne Frank. And I was just bored. And that's a very bizarre response. I was bored by everything in relation to the Holocaust. For me, my response was, oh, there we go again. I've heard this story so many times. And then I was, suddenly hooked by some artworks, not historical artworks. For instance, the work by Anselm Kiefer. So in a way, and that is how I came into that. So my work on Holocaust representation, for instance, in Caught by History, is very much about, I would say, deconstructing this opposition between the historical and the imaginative. Mm-hmm. And I think there is a very important place for the imaginative in order to get people interested in that past.
We both live in the Netherlands. Yeah. And every year, the 4th of May, we remember those who have fallen in the Second World War. And there's always a discussion about how do you keep people interested, because, well, if I speak for myself, my poor grandparents passed away. My grandfather, who was the oldest, passed away last year. Yeah. And for me, those are the only, let's say, eyewitnesses around me of what happened there. Yeah. So there's a discussion about how to keep people involved. And if I hear you, then using the imagination could perhaps be something to do there?
Yes, indeed, because I think, at least for myself, I became interested and I became hooked by that past through imaginative representations, through fiction, through artworks, and not through documentaries and or testimonies or diaries. And because my response to that is, again and again, I'm reading the same story, again and again, the same, in a way, with the same moral. And I was just bored by that. And I was not bored by the imaginative representation. And another thing is that for many people, this kind of binary opposition is, as it can be translated in history is the real, is the truth, or the historical, whereas and it is opposed to a lie, which is false. And it's bizarre because in our culture, fiction and art is highly respected, but not in the context of the Holocaust. Then suddenly people activate a completely simplistic notion of the imaginative. Mm-hmm. The imaginative is not false, is not a lie. Yeah. But for many people, it is. In that field of Holocaust studies, people fall back in a notion of fiction and the imaginative, which is, I would say, not only dated, but false in itself.
So one of the people who may have been an advocate at that in first instance was Adorno, who was a Holocaust survivor. And he wrote that it's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. How can you even make art after Auschwitz? But he actually came back from that as well. Huh?
Yeah. At the moment, he meant something completely else.
Yeah.
Adorno, when he understood that his claim that to write poetry or to read poetry after the Holocaust is barbaric was completely misunderstood, then he explained it again. And what for him was a problem, not that poetry is fictional or imaginative and that it is lying. No, but for him it was a problem that we can get, and you can say, aesthetic pleasure out of a poem about such a horrible thing. That's very paradoxical. When we read poems of Celan, we say, "Yay, this is a beautiful poem! What an impressive poem!" So we get aesthetic pleasure out of that. So we get aesthetic pleasure out of a text that is about something horrible. And that was the kind of contradiction Adorno was struggling with. And his first remark or statement is very critical about the fact that we get aesthetic pleasure, that we are impressed by a poem like that, whereas it is about something horrible.
Yeah, I have the quote here of what he said afterwards in Negative Dialectics. I'll read that one. So he writes, "It may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems. But it is not wrong to raise the less cultural question, whether after Auschwitz you can go on living, especially whether one who escaped by accident, one who by all rights should have been killed, may have been living." And then later it's obvious that he writes about himself, because in a few sentences later he writes that he is plagued by dreams, that he is no longer living at all, that he was sent to the ovens in 1944, and his whole existence since then has been imaginary, an enunciation of the insane wish of a man killed 20 years earlier. Well, when I read this, and when I read the Negative Dialectics, and when I read in the essay Testimonies and the Limits of Representation, you do analyze testimonies from people from the Holocaust. So for me, it's very, very difficult to read that. And
you need to read these the testimonies I quote.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to watch a movie about the Holocaust. It's one thing to remember, oh yeah, this was important. But it's another thing to read and listen to the actual words of the people who were there. And how is that?
Yeah. First of all, you were impressed by my quotations out of testimonies. But of course, these quotations were very selective, and they also had a very particular function. Because I was trying to explain and demonstrate what it is exactly that causes trauma.
Yeah.
And I have 4 possible reasons for that. But when I did for this chapter or this article, I did research in the Fortune Video Archive at Yale Studies. That was initiated, that archive, by Jeffrey Hartman and Dory Laub. And so that was a long time before Spielberg started to do the same. But when you do research in an archive like that, you would expect that you are impressed all the time by these testimonies.
Yeah.
No, the opposite is the case. You are getting bored. There we go again. The same kind of stories.
Yeah.
And it's also, and there, how do you say, that also touches on the idea, or my notion of trauma, that something is traumatic when the symbolic order does not offer terms, concepts, narrative plots in a way to experience the event or the situation you are involved in. And that's also becomes clear in those testimonies. After those people who had survived Auschwitz or other camps, for them it was almost impossible to tell what they had experienced. And not only that, in the 1950s and 60s, it was not only difficult to tell, people were also not interested in listening to those people.
Yeah.
Europe, but also Israel, had to be built and rebuilt, and we needed heroes in those days and not victims. So those traumatized peoples, they were just not interesting to listen to. But then, was it already in the early 1950s? For instance, then suddenly there was this narrative about this famous Nazi doctor Mengele.
Yeah.
And So that's provided to a lot of Holocaust survivors a narrative to tell, in a way, that what has been unimaginable and could also not be narrated. But the funny thing is, and especially historians in Holocaust studies have criticized those people, many people, in a way, use that narrative of the Nazi Dr. Mengele to tell their own narrative, whereas in many cases it's completely impossible because they were in another concentration camp so then you can say this is a false testimony. No, it's not. But in order to tell what they had experienced, they made use of a kind of conventional narrative about this horrible Nazi doctor. That's the only way to in a way, to testify of the horrible things which happened to them in the camp. Yeah. So, and that means, and then we come also in a way back to the issue of Plato's cave and the allegory. So experience is never direct, in a way. Even what we experience is a mediation through and in the symbolic order, but also the narrative plots which are part of that symbolic order. And symbolic order, in a way, is a Lacanian term, a psychoanalytic term. But are, in a way, the rules, the distinctions, the laws, the languages which are used at a specific moment. And when you grow up, you are introduced in that symbolic order. Yeah, but that means that every experience is already a mediation. You are mediated by the symbolic order in which you grow up. Mm. So there is no experience is never direct, is never authentic, but it is mediated by the culture you live in. And I think the fact that so many Holocaust survivors who were traumatized had no narratives or no symbolic order which could be used to, in a way, to tell their stories, they suddenly fall back on this conventional narrative of the Nazi doctor. And I think they were not lying when they were doing that or giving a false testimony, but it was the only way to tell their story about something which could not be told.
If I just try to summarize your point about experience, you studied the Holocaust, you studied testimonies and art about the Holocaust, but you also want to say something about experience. And if I use the word experience, I just think about, well, I'm sitting here now and we're speaking and I'm experiencing this. Or yesterday, I had a very nice experience when it was very warm and I walked outside in the sun. I think the way people normally look at experience is it's very direct. You experience what you experience. You can, even if you are dreaming or something, I may be dreaming right now, but I still know that I'm experiencing. So it's very direct. And only I can experience what I experience. So if I witness a crime and later the police ask me about what happened, or if a crime happened to me, I just have to basically express what I experienced. I have to express what I remember about this experience. And although we can think about, sometimes this memory is accurate or inaccurate, I can try to remember as best as I can what I experienced and then just tell this to you without any imagination, without any interpretation. So that's kind of how I think most people would look at experience, right? And from what you say is you fundamentally disagree with that.
Yeah, what you just described, that's the kind of common sense idea about experience, and then is experience indeed authentic, can be not completely accurate, but as such it is authentic and not mediated. I am saying that every experience, or when you partake in a certain event or situation, the way to experience it is in a way, to mediate it through the symbolic order, which means that, in a way, every experience is a representation already.
Afterwards, when you remember it, or during the experience.
When you become conscious of it, it's not only when you remember it, but when you even when you say to yourself, "Oh, this is a really nice day." That's not a memory. That is, you're just telling that to yourself. That is already an experience, but that is a mediation. And that's, but why do I need this notion of experience as being mediated, as being in a way already a representation? That enables me also to define trauma. And when something cannot be experienced because the symbolic order does not provide narratives, concepts, or whatever, then it becomes traumatic. And then trauma, that is something which is in a way, you can say, stored in the body, and it's being reenacted. And every time that trauma is being reenacted, it comes back in its full immediacy, so not mediated, but in its full immediacy, as if it happens again. In order, in a way, it's almost a kind of therapeutic process, in the sense that the hope is, or the intention behind the reenactment, that at last that unexperienced event can perhaps be experienced in or after its reenactment.
Yeah.
But usually it does not work like that. So reenactments happen again and again and again. And it's only in a kind of therapeutic process that the unexperienced event or situation can be at last retrospectively experienced for the first time.
And that's in the testimonies of the Holocaust survivors. You show that you say that actually for them it's not the past. They are still there. When they describe it, they don't speak in the past tense.
No, indeed. People who are traumatized live in two presents. You can say the present we are also living in as non-traumatized people, and in the present of that past event that is reenacted in the present. And that makes being traumatized extremely difficult, because it undermines temporality, the kind of conventional temporality of past, present, future. And those people are living in several presents at the same time.
So that's a very important distinction between perhaps how we use trauma in everyday language. Maybe we use trauma like, oh, this was so traumatic, in the sense, oh, this was such a horrible thing that happened to me. Yeah,
that's the big problem of the term trauma nowadays. And it's only that it has become fashionable to talk about trauma, but usually it doesn't mean anything. When I had a flat tire, I can say that was traumatic because I had a flat tire. And no, because for me, when I talk about trauma, it is not about something horrible by definition. Because this idea that trauma is when a certain situation or event cannot be mediated or absorbed by the symbolic order, then you can say that usually that those moments or situations are, how do you say that, horrible, like rape, sexual abuse, or something like the Holocaust, and so on. But theoretically, it can also be something beautiful, something which is so great, so beautiful, something so sublime that so that's contradictory. Not contradictory from this theoretical perspective. Something absolutely beautiful can also be traumatic.
And in many cases of trauma, that's actually sometimes what people struggle with, right? That that it was a horrible event, and they also experience something like beauty or something like that. And how can those two fit together?
Yes.
Now I'm very curious about how you interpret Plato's allegory.
What is for me very interesting about Plato's allegory of the cave is that he uses an image, an allegory, in a way to warn about, you can say, the illusionary status of shadows and images. It's only behind that there is the light, the true knowledge, or the true, in his the world of ideas. In his case, in the Platonian world. But and that is a very interesting paradox. How can he? So at first, you can read his allegory as completely iconoclastic. You should never trust shadows, images. So, but I think that is not what, but when he is really iconoclastic, why would he use an image with this kind of message? So this is not the message of his allegory. I think that Plato claims that we are, in a way, always that we should never confuse representations and what they mean. And that is, and so, but in a way, that's the only world we live in. These shadows and the puppets and the puppets who create the shadows.
Yeah, we live in a world of representations. If you speak about experience, it fundamentally has to do with the symbolic order, with the kind of narrative frames and the representations we have access to.
And for instance, it's very interesting that in this allegorical narrative, that ultimately those people who are imprisoned in the cave want to return to that world of representation. Because in a way that light, or this kind of true knowledge, or the real, you can say, the real world, no, that is too much. But when you translate this into a kind of Lacanian psychoanalytic perspective, it's also interesting to see that in Lacan, the real is written with a capital, and the real is by definition traumatic. So something we cannot face, something we cannot understand, something which is beyond our understanding, outside, but which is also traumatic, because it cannot be absorbed in the world of representation and of shadows.
Yeah, because that's what Plato writes, is the prisoner who's released. You would think he would be happy that he's liberated, but no, he has to be dragged up. His eyes hurt. It's painful, and all he wants to do is run back to his seat again.
Because then so in a way that is comparable to the people who survived Auschwitz and other camps. That is too traumatic. So that is the real. And they, in a way, escape back into the world of representations. That's the only solution. Yeah. So the real, with a capital, is outside representation and cannot be mediated. And that, I think that is very interesting, how, in a way, Plato's allegory and my notion of trauma indeed have a lot in common.
Yeah. But when I read your essay, Testimonies and the Limits of Representation, I also read a kind of a hopeful message in it, because you, as you just said before as well, one of the difficulties for the Holocaust survivors is that at the moment they were in the historical event, but they did not experience it because they did not have the symbolic order to have this experience. And later, they returned to, let's say, society, or we could compare it to a veteran returning from the war into society. You describe how they are interviewed. But even the kind of questions that the interviewer asks is already kind of imposing a certain narrative. Or we could speak of what you just mentioned about Schindler's List, the happy ending. The happy ending in this case would be, wow, and you were liberated from Auschwitz. And how did you feel? But in the testimonies you described that they say, well, actually, that's when it got even worse.
For many people who were completely traumatized, it became worse after they were liberated, because while they were still in the camp, in a way, their whole life was completely one-dimensional, but it could also be understood in a way. But after the liberation, then they got the reenactments, and then they were tortured by whatever, and that made it even worse and less understandable. So then the true hell started after the liberation. That's what many people who survived, testified.
Here in the Netherlands, in recent years, there's been a lot of attention for people from Indonesia who were imprisoned in Japanese camps, and they returned. They came into a post-Second World War Netherlands, and they got comments like, well, okay, for you it was horrible too, but at least you had a little sunshine. So I compared to this as well. My grandmother was in one of these camps, and when she spoke about that, she spoke about it, but it was like we were just having an ordinary conversation, and she was just throwing in. She never spoke about it, and then sometimes she just threw in a line like, "Oh yeah," and then sometimes somebody gave us some rice through the fence. But it didn't have the emotional weight or whatever what I would expect. At the same time, now I'm thinking she did find a way to process it inside of the narrative structure, which maybe now maybe we were just speaking about food or something like that, or being hungry.
No, indeed. And I think it was your grandmother. She probably, in a way, tried to, how do you say that? I would say to transform this traumatized temporality into a kind of conventional and normal temporality we all live in. So I think it is very important also that she talked about this in the past tense instead of the present tense.
Okay. Yeah, and I started out saying that I did seem to read a hope in your essay, because you say it's not that the Holocaust. We may think about other traumatic events. It's not fundamentally unrepresentable, because representation can also change.
Indeed. Representation, or this other psychoanalytic term, the symbolic order, is not static, it's not fixed. And I would say, especially it is in the domain of literature and art, that people try to transform, in a way, the symbolic order. And that can only be done in a very modest way. You cannot just completely overturn the symbolic order. No, that's completely impossible. But still, in a very modest way, you can try to change the conventionality of the symbolic order. And that is why I have much more respect for arts and literature than for the historical discipline, because they cannot do that, whereas literature and art can do that.
If I think about this, because I did not live through the Second World War, and most of the people who did are now either very old or they will not be with us anymore. But are there any situations like, I cannot even say like that, because you make very clear that the Holocaust, it cannot serve as a metaphor or anything like that. But are there any are there people in our society who experience trauma that we can work on creating maybe a symbolic order or a way in which their stories can be heard?
But by the way, I would never say that the Holocaust cannot be used as a comparison to other apocalyptic, difficult situation. And because that's also one of the taboos in Holocaust studies, that the Holocaust is unique. Mm-hmm. So you're not allowed to compare it to whatever. And to say that slavery was a kind of black Holocaust that's completely taboo or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, I think that's a complete misunderstanding about what you do when you compare or when you turn something into a metaphor. When you compare something, you're not claiming that they are identical. But they have something, when you compare, there is something what now two entities have in common, but of course there are many differences. Yeah. And just this kind of cliche, enormous cliche about the Holocaust, that the Holocaust was unique. Why exactly? Be more precise. I think what made the Holocaust unique is that for the first time, kind of the technology of modernity was used for a genocide. But genocides, there are
Armenian genocide.
We still have them, and there comes no end to genocides. And I even don't know if the number of victims in the Holocaust was more than other genocides. Yeah, some, but not all of them. So when we say the Holocaust is unique, you first have to explain unique in what respect, and then you can see if it can be used as an image, as a metaphor, as a comparison. Yeah. And I think this is such a cliche and a dogma in the field of Holocaust studies that it makes any, I would say, discussion and reflection impossible.
I mentioned Adorno before, and Adorno was one of the people who tried to, I think, as I understand it, make clear that maybe the actual events are not like taking place as they did back then, but the kind of thinking that was behind it, the way people treat each other. Yeah. That's actually, he even went so far as to say maybe that's the current model of our society.
For instance, when you compare that happened in the 1960s and 70s, I think, the genocide in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge, it was also completely industrial and also completely archival, like the Holocaust. But when you compare it to the genocide in Serbia, in Croatia, much more recently, that genocide, for instance, was a very old-fashioned genocide, not industrial, just people killing each other, or one group killing the other. And so, and that's very interesting. And you almost need the Holocaust to understand not the fact that they're all genocides, but also how they differ and what what is in a way unique, but also not completely unique about the Holocaust, because the genocide in Cambodia was more in common than in how they differed.
Yeah. So one obvious link would be if I ask, okay, I wonder myself what people might I encounter on the street that may have experienced trauma, then we can think of refugees who came from extreme situations to the Netherlands, and they come into a certain narrative as well, because they are, here's the discourse, I think in many countries is like, oh, they just come here to take advantage of our, beautiful Western blah, blah, blah.
Oh, indeed. And for me, it is also very important that this notion of trauma does not, in a way, legitimize a kind of hierarchy in, this is more horrible than something else, or this is more traumatic than another event was traumatic. And so there is no hierarchy. So in the sense that a very, minor experience of just one person can also be understood from this notion of trauma and experience, and can be as traumatic as the Holocaust. Trauma has less to do with the event than with, I would say, the relationship between the event and the symbolic order and its mediation. So it makes it, to understood these kind of experiences, or better, non-experiences, it has nothing to do with the scope of the event or the scope of the history.
So how do you view the Metoo movement in this light? Is there a relation to trauma? And I know you did an exhibition called Shame and Masculinity, which also addresses this.
Yeah, this has certainly to do with trauma, in the sense that for a very long time, these kind of experiences of rape, sexual abuse, and so on, were completely unspeakable. Indeed, people were silenced about it, but also not only that there was no space to tell it, but for a very long time, they did not really know what they had experienced, and was this something negative? Was this positive? Was this what was it? And now the good thing I think about Me Too, when suddenly a lot of women, but also men, start to tell about these events, that suddenly people, in a way, how do you say that? They are provided with a kind of narrative which can be used for their own experiences. So yes, you can say that the problem of the Me Too situation is, of course, also that a lot of people, make use of this kind of Me Too moment also just for financial gain or whatever, just to be to create a scandal. But let's just talk about the positive effects of the Me Too movement for many people who were victims of these kind of events or experiences that could not be told or could not be experienced really when they happened. They were too confusing and too that they use now, in a way, the narratives or the stories that come out as a mediation for their own untold experiences. And that's very positive. That's healing.
And what can we do? And then I say we because we are both white men. And although, of course, there's also male victims of Me Too.
Yeah.
In general, it's most of them are women, I think. And we are not directly involved in that. But when I read about that, I do feel a sense of responsibility. Because the let's say the conditions that enabled these events to happen have a lot to do with male privilege, and we can say all those things. And so when the title of your exhibition is Shame, is when I hear those things, I do feel a kind of shame, not a personal shame, but another kind of shame. And then I wonder, what can I do?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. What can you do? No, at least to become or to be aware of the fact that you are living in a society where there is still a kind of white or male privilege, and so the good thing also is for white men or for men as such, is that usually the people who are not living up to the kind of white male standards of our society are in one way or another shameful. And now, because of the Me Too scandals, you can say, especially white men, not only, but especially white men who are being made shameful So I think that when you ask what can we do or what is our responsibility, is I would say as a white man, it can be very positive and very transformative to experience shame, because a lot of non-white people, and perhaps also a lot of women, especially also again when they are not white, because of course our society is changing a lot, and but still to experience that kind of shame as a white man can be very positive, because many people in our societies experience that on a daily basis because of the white male standards of our society.
Mm-hmm. This is also, of course, the kind of conversation, the collective conversation in relation to slavery.
Yeah.
Right? Where people say, okay, it was horrible, but it was a long time ago and I didn't have anything to do with it. So why should I feel anything about it? Yeah.
In this book, Shame and Masculinity, which you just mentioned, there's a very important contribution by Wabi Long. He is a psychoanalyst, an academic at the University of Cape Town. And he writes about the South African situation and the very intricate relationship between shame and violence. Why is the South African society such a violent society? And not only with, but especially Black men have grown up in a situation in which they can never, because of their skin, live up to the standards of that society. So they grew up in a situation of shame and envy, and that is so extreme that explains and also results in the kind of extreme violence in that country. Mm-hmm. So how do you work through shame? How do you process shame? Not just by how do you say that, the kind of static situation of isolation, because you're always isolated in shame. There's a kind of communication broken with other people. But no, I think it is completely understandable that people try to work through that isolation of shame by becoming extremely violent. And by raping their own women, but by also by violence against white people. Yes.
Yeah. The larger, this is such a fascinating topic to think about for me, because we started speaking about the Holocaust, we speak about different concrete ways, but in the end, we try to say something about experience in general and trauma in general and memory in general by looking at these kind of extreme cases. And I can say that one in one of, I think it was the second episode, I shared how I started, as I remember, becoming interested in philosophy because I went with my mother to Malaysia and we entered the house of her friends, and there was no coat rack. And for me, that was like a very strange experience, because I realized in the Netherlands, every time you enter a house, there's a coat rack, but that's not the case. What else might not be the case?
Yeah.
Another, I think, formative experience or something which shaped me as well is that I was in Denmark with my partner at the time, and her grandfather was there, and it was this huge Danish family gathering with I don't know how many children and grandchildren. And it was like the room was full of children and grandchildren. I was sitting there and she told me the story that her grandfather was actually, he escaped the camp during the Second World War. And before he was captured, he was this kind of, young man enjoying life, happy and single. And then after he escaped, he decided, okay, no, I want to marry, I want to have a family, and I want to have lots of children.
Yeah.
And it made me wonder, what makes it that for one person to experience or be part of an event, it's a trauma, and for the other person, it could be even an instigation or a motivation to change their life, or to some people become religious, or some people change their entire life. Let me ask the question, does everybody experience a trauma? No, that's not it. So why did some people in the camps experience it as traumatic and others did not? I know it's a big question, but...
No, it's a very important question. Earlier, I said that trauma can never be explained by the extremity of the event. And that's even the case for the Holocaust. For many people, and probably most people, the people who survived, that has been traumatic, but not for everybody. And just people, there are also people who survived and had no major problems after they had survived. And there's also has been research from a gender perspective, and then it turns out that, in a way, men in the concentration camps died faster than women, and they were also more traumatized than women. And how can that be? What is why is it that many women could cope much more easily with this kind of extreme situations in a concentration camp? Now, one explanation is that, of course, many of the people who entered were Jews and Orthodox Jews, and in those Orthodox societies, the place of women was by definition, how do you say that, completely below that of men. Their subjectivities were reduced to something not very expensive, not very big. And but when men and women entered a concentration camp, their subjectivities was reduced to nothing. They were no longer dealt with as real subjects, with responsibility, with freedom, with whatever. And I think that had much more impact on men than on women, because their subjectivities in the culture, the Orthodox culture they came from, was already limited. And I think that explains why in our patriarchal societies, the egos of men are more inflated than those of women. And especially in those days during the Second World War. Now it is a little bit different. I think there are now especially men that have big problems, young men, because they have no role models, or they do not know how to live their masculinity anymore. And for women, young women, it is much easier to, how do you say that, to become a subject than for young men, I think. But during the Second World War, that was very different. And I think it were especially men who had inflated egos. And that also explains why it was, in a way, more traumatic for men than for women.
Yeah, you write even that they had to, there's this phrase, I think it's by, you quote someone, Langer,
yeah.
The paradoxical killing of the self by the self in order to keep the self alive.
Yeah. And especially that part, I think, was in those days, no longer, but in those days, for women, especially when they came from an Orthodox background, much easier than for men. Yes.
Now, do you know this book called And There Was Light by Jacques Lucero?
No.
It's an interesting book by a French resistance fighter who was blind since the age of 7. And there's this passage that made me think about this as well. He actually, it's not about himself, but he describes someone in the camps. He describes the horrible he was in Buchenwald, and he describes the horrible conditions in the camps, and how there was one man who seemingly, he was laughing and making jokes and making other people feel better. He reminds me a little bit of this movie, The Beautiful Life, or
My Beautiful
Bella
Life.
Vita.
Yeah. La Vita è Bella. Yeah.
La Vita è Bella. Yeah.
Yeah.
When he asked this man about this, how come that you are not, how can you even laugh? How can you make jokes? And then this man, he calls him Jeremy. He says, well, for one who knows how to see, things are just as they always are.
Yeah.
And later he says that in ordinary life with good eyes, we would have seen the same horrors. We had managed to be happy before. Well, the Nazis had given us a terrible microscope, the camp. This was not a reason to stop living. So for this man, apparently, he says, well, what happens now might be an extreme version of something that was actually there all the time.
Yeah. And what is so beautiful about what Mitterrand is his name?
Lucero.
Lucero, yeah. What he in a way also implies is that his imaginative way of coping with that reality in the camp is as real as the camp itself.
So he's able at that moment to live in this. Yeah. So since your work on the Holocaust was, I think, from 2000, the essays from 2004 or
something
before?
like that.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
What are you working on at the moment?
I just finished this book on shame and masculinity, but I'm doing another book and exhibition together with H401. That's the institution, the kind of museum gallery in Amsterdam. And that's about productive archiving. And in a way, I have published a book on the archive, I think 10 years ago, Staging the Archive. And this is a kind of sequel to that project. But my interest in archiving also was a result of Holocaust, my work on the Holocaust. Because I was amazed by the fact that what I told you earlier, that there is this very strong, how do you say that, preference and privilegization for all kinds of historical genres, like in Holocaust studies, the documentary, the testimony, the diary, but also the archive. And so whereas I was confronted, and I think I also wrote about Caught by History already, but also especially in that book, Staging the Archive, and there I have a whole chapter, that these kind of industrial genocides, like the Holocaust, but also the one by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, were big archival machines. Because the master archivists were the Nazis. And they archived people, their belongings, everything. So this complete respect for the archive, I think, it's very dangerous and naive. And in our culture, the archive is only seen as a kind of scholarly or scientific tool. And I think that the archive is much more. There's a kind of organization which also defines our thinking. And we also think by making lists, by categorizing phenomena, by making things, by making collections. So it is not only in an institution like a museum or a library or a city archive. No, for me, archiving is a mode of thinking. And we comparable to, for instance, telling stories. Whereas a narrative is always considered to be one of the most symbolic ways of how people make sense of their life and their futures. And we have also in scholarship many narrative theories to understand how do you say that, how that works, storytelling. But we know very little about archiving as a mode of thinking and how we make sense of the world by means of archival thinking. And that's why I wrote that book, Staging the Archive. And this new project, exhibition and book is called Productive Archiving. and which immediately implies that a lot of archiving is not productive and is even killing. Like deadly in the case of these kind of genocides, which were big archival machines, but also in others. And there are two major problems of the archive. An archive has always an inside and as an outside. And you see, for instance, now in the last 20 years that people started to make post-colonial archives, queer archives, and so on. And I can understand that as something possible because those people who were for a long time, in a way, outside the archive, and you only exist in a way, you only can be recognized when you're inside the archive. So for those people who have been, in a way, for centuries or decades, been outside the archive, they want their own archive because it's only then that they exist. And a very good example, for instance, is the artist, South African artist, Santu Mofokeng. He is a black photographer, but he also, 20 or 30 years ago, he started to collect and make an archive of photographs of black bourgeois people. So in these kind of studio portraits in bourgeois, and of course they existed. But until then, the official archives had never been interested in that because black people were only archived in the official institutions as the natives, from a kind of anthropological perspective, not as bourgeois people like the white people. And so he started to create his archive and to make, in a way, visible those images, but also those black, bourgeois identities, which were completely, how do you say that, ignored and invisible within the context of the official institutions. But then there's a second problem with the archive, and that is the moment you are, in a way, integrated into an archive, the moment when you are archived, you only exist under the kind of category under which you are archived. So never as a unique individual. And that's one of the reasons why I am also a little bit, I have my doubts of how sexual identities are being archived at the moment as LHBTQ. Okay, when you do that, you are inside the archive, but you exist only as a sexual identity.
Yeah.
Nothing else. Is that what you want? You see, that's one of I would say, the archive is also completely confining. That's the little bit the problem almost. When you're outside the archive, you do not exist. But when you're inside the archive, you are very much confined by the category under which you are being archived. And so in that moment, from that perspective, it is you have perhaps more freedom when you escape outside the archive again.
Yeah, I in my conversation with Mika Ball in the third episode, I shared my favorite line from her documentary Vera about this little girl. And at one point, her mother says, I don't think it's necessary to have a clear identity.
Yeah.
And after that, I've been wondering, is it even possible to say, well, I don't really... So it's a lot of focus on, okay, so let's create extra categories or let's acknowledge these categories, which could be a very productive step as well. But is it even possible in our society to say, well, I don't really want to have a clear identity. I don't really feel the need to be in an archive.
And I think, especially nowadays, when identity politics is the most important thing a lot of people can imagine, I think it is extremely confining, and it would be very liberating not to have a clear identity. Yes, I completely agree with you or with this woman in this film. Yes. But of course, it is a kind of luxury to say that.
Yes. Because you are not always in charge of your cultural identity. Yeah.
So but this new project is all about productive archiving. Yeah. And it is interesting because, as I explained already, that thinking about archiving and the archive that came out of my work on Holocaust and trauma. And so it's not that there is suddenly I was bored and started to do something completely else. No.
So that's a way you try to learn about the kind of world you live in for yourself, if I understand correctly, and what you can do about it, what you can do maybe to make it a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. I would like to add one more thing, because another thing what we have not talked about so far, and what I've also been working on since the last 10 years, and it is related to trauma, but still something very different, and that is affect, affect theory, and how does affect work. And that is, and of course, this book on shame and masculinity is also about shame, and it's a major affect. And although now sometimes people even conflate trauma and affect as if trauma is an affect, and I don't think that. But what trauma and affect have in common is that they go both in a way, they go beyond representation and beyond meaning making.
So is that different than just saying emotion or how you feel about something?
I think affect for me is a kind of intensity, and that you have to process something when you experience affect, where you have to do something with it. Yeah, you can ignore it, but you can process it into an emotion, but you can also process it into, like Lucero, for instance, says, it shocks to thoughts. So you can also process it into this kind of new way of thinking, a kind of thinking which is not conventional, but something new. So affect and emotion, no. An emotion is an affect after the affect has been processed. So it is a qualified affect.
So an affect is something that touches you, that you feel, but that is raw, unprocessed, and maybe instigates you to try to make sense of it.
In a way, we should not talk about affect, because affect suggests that it is a thing you can describe, and it is a kind of entity. But I think there's also it's better to talk about an affective transmission. So it is always something which takes place between a text and you as a reader, or between one person and another person. And so it is a kind of transmission, and it is not an entity, it's a process.
Is that dependent on the discursive order as well, like experience, or does it go beyond?
No, and I think that is exactly what it has in common with trauma. It both is, in a way, by you say trauma is a kind of failed experience, because it could not be mediated by the discursive order or the symbolic order. Whereas affect is indeed an affective transmission can result in thinking, and that means that it is, in a way, also how do you say that, processed into the symbolic or the discursive order, but not by definition. The transmission itself is outside that domain, but it influences that domain all the time. It has impacts on that domain.
I'm thinking about, maybe this is a completely, how do you say that, banal example, but I'm thinking about Lord of the Rings, where Sam and Frodo are in Mordor and they're having these horrible experiences, and then Sam is looking at the stars and he has this moment where I don't even know the exact quote, but what I remember from it is that he's walking there and he has this moment where he's touched by something, and it gives him the strength to go on.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You can say this is a kind of little story about affective transmission. Yes. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah.
Well, great. So that's something maybe to pay attention to. What happens to us in our daily lives that touches you, that you don't necessarily you cannot necessarily make sense of it, but it is still there.
Yeah, indeed. It is real, and it affects our lives, and also it affects the way we live our lives. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with me today.
It was a pleasure, really.
And thank you for listening. Sorry, I butchered the Lord of the Rings quote at the end. We were speaking about affect, a shock to thought. Let me read it to you. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Oscar Wilde wrote, "We're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars." After spending some time in the gutter today, next month, let's look at the stars. I will speak with astrophysicist Vincent Icke. For more episodes and ways to support this podcast, go to livefromplatoscave.com. I hope to see you again next month.